Okay, let's start so we can get out in time for lunch. Welcome, and great to have such a good turnout. I will be talking today about Migrate API, and from a point of view of doing data migrations, importations flexibly. Migrate API is, I think, one of the most important features in Drupal 8. Here's a quick agenda. So first I will give a short introduction on what Migrate API is. Then I will talk about migrating Drupal sites, and then I will go into migrating various sources, whatever is your customer needs. But first, I will say a few words about myself. My name is Jari Nousiainen. Like you can probably see, I work for Siili Solutions as a senior developer and a Drupal team lead. I'm very fond of open source in general, and for example, the Drupal community has a special place in my heart. And I picked the image because I love tea and I know a lot about it. And if you want to talk with me about something else in Drupal, then tea is a good choice. Quick fact about Siili. We have offices in Helsinki, Oulu, Berlin, Wrocław, Poland, and then small operations in New York and Los Angeles. The 407 is already a bit outdated. We have over 500 employees nowadays. And we do all kinds of development. We're platform and software agnostic company. We do full service from design to data management. And Drupal is one of those platforms we work on. So, first things first, when should you use migration? Because it's not obvious that the migration is the best way to go. First of all, if you have lots of content, if you should calculate how much does it take developers time to create the migrations, because it's not trivial. It takes some time, and then there's always to consider the time the content editors will have to do after the migration, because migration will not be perfect right away on a new site. So if there's just a little of content, then it's probably easier to get somebody to just copy-paste it. Then there's, of course, the value of content. Does the client want to keep the content, or do they want to rewrite it? Do they want to reconstruct the site? And then there's the case, which for me is the most interesting, I think, is that when you need to get some data from some outside source or another system of the client's another system, which is it might be ongoing, so that the data needs to be updated regularly. You can use the incremental migrations for that. So, what is Migrate API? I think probably most of you know about it. Maybe many of you probably have tried it. But let's start with the basics. This is from the Drupal Migrate API overview documentation. It's the first sentence, but it tells you what its essence actually is. The Migration API provides services for migrating data from one place to another, usually, and I want to stress the word usually, importing it into Drupal entities. This tells you about what the process is about. It has a kind of almost philosophical point to it, I think, and I want to illustrate it by this picture. So you have data in place A, and you want it to go to place B, and those can be actually whatever. So in the simplest case, of course, you have Drupal 6, Drupal 7 site, and you want to move the data into Drupal 8. That's kind of trivial that you would want to do that. You might have some other CMS, say WordPress or Liferay, SharePoint, And you want to move it into Drupal 8 because, well, of course you want to move it into Drupal 8. Because you would want to use Drupal 8. Then you can have data in JSON, XML, CSV, some format. You can get the data from some API, or it just present in some structured format, and you want to get into Drupal 8. You can do that too. And then, at least in theory, you could do it the other way around. You could move the data to somewhere else. It doesn't have to be Drupal 8. It's technically possible. I don't know if I can't tell you a case where you would want to do that. What would be an example? But I think that's an important possibility to keep in mind from the point of view of the sentence on the previous slide. So these are the key tools you will need when you're doing migrations based on the idea I'll be presenting now. So there's some of the key features here that you will need to write configuration YAMLs. Migrate Plus is a very good contrib module that provides you with extensions to the core Migrate features. And then Migrate Tools provides you a Drush interface, which you will probably want to use when actually running the migrations and debugging them. There are also other modules for user interface and for the Drupal migration, but I will not be concentrating on those now. So the migration flow. First, you have the source, which is, let's say, a Drupal 7 database. You have a source plugin that takes the data from the source and puts it in and pulls it in as rows. Then you have processing, where you take the rows and process each of the column or field on the row in some way so that it will fit into the destination. And then you just push the data into the destination. For example, when pushing the data into Drupal 8 entities like nodes as content, it's usually quite trivial to use the destination plugins. You just select the plugin, for example, entity node, and then you point to the bundle you want to import it in, and it just handles it easily. It's the simplest thing. But this part has to do with the possibility of dealing with some other destination too. Source plugins. In core, there are 79 classes that are source plugins, or they might be some base plugin classes too. So the figure is not exact. There are useful base classes for you to use in custom migrations, SQL-based, Drupal SQL-based, source plugin-based, so that you can just extend those and implement the methods you need to implement, not to get you started. So you can usually the data is taken from database, and there's a query method that will pull the data. Here, for example, it takes taxonomy terms, and then there's a field method which processes those into source fields. And then this is the configuration you need to use that taxonomy term source plugin. It's very simple. The derivers are an important piece in this because they map the fields that are not contained in the D7 entity itself. They map those fields into the source entity you're getting, so that you're getting actually all the additional fields, not just the fields included in the entity. Processing is probably the interesting part because it it deals with transforming the content and making it fit into the destination fields. So process plugin takes source fields and defines some kind of processing for those so that they will match what the database expects in the destination. There are some examples of process plugins that I have used a lot in a migration that I've been doing. For example, combining fields with concat, putting in default values, processing multiple value columns in a field with iterator plugin, and especially with the custom migrations, process plugins like extract and flatten to deal with arrays coming out of the source data have been really useful. It's very easy to write your own process plugins, and if you're doing custom migrations, you probably want to and need to do something because the core plugins don't always do exactly what you want. But because of the object-oriented approach in Drupal 8, it's very simple to just build on whatever there is already available. And a special mention about the Migrate plugin, which takes another migration to process the data. So, for example, if you're migrating term references in a node, then you will then you will get the term IDs in the new database from the migration of the terms, and then you will map those into the nodes you are putting into the destination. I probably can't explain that really well because you need to think it through, but you probably get the idea. And then that needs to be used also with translations, which are probably interesting to people here because multilingual sites are very common. About translations, I want to say already now that the documentation on migrating translations is very scarce, and you will need to experiment with it. Yes. So, and destination plugins, they're kind of simple thing. In core, they of course deal with inserting data into Drupal 8 entities, and entities in this means also configuration entities. In this presentation, I probably talk about content and data in the sense that it usually means content entities, but migrating configuration entities is also a similar process. So you can, if you need to, you can migrate, say, views or whatever configuration you have in D7.
I think views is specifically not migrated at the moment.
It's not supported right now?
I think they gave up on it.
Oh, okay. Too complicated. Yeah, okay. But still, there is you can get some data into configuration in D8 anyways. So
variables config, it's handled and it's very easy.
Yeah.
Tried and failed.
okay. And I would also like to point out that when you're migrating an old site, one thing that is very useful to do with migration is the URL aliases, because if your site structure changes and the URLs change, you will want to keep the old links working. So you want redirects, so you can take the paths from the old database and migrate them into URL aliases in D8. And that is actually very simple to do, and doesn't take even very long. So I do recommend that you try that out if you're facing the need for that. So about migrating a Drupal site, there are two options. You can use the Drupal migration, which has a UI, and it's very simple. Personally, I haven't tried how it works actually, but there is 6-point instructions on Drupal.org, and it promises it takes no time at all. But it's a different thing that I am talking about now, because that process takes the whole site and it tries to move everything as such, all the content types as they are. It's for just getting your old site into Drupal 8. Nothing changed, basically. It is a simple process, but what I find more interesting here is that when you build a new site on Drupal 8, the old site is probably some years old, and you don't want to keep all the burden you have from that. You want to restructure the content, you want to build better content types, so you will want to build a custom migration. You will want to maybe select only some content types that you need to move. There might be some transformations in some way that you need to do for the content. So I will talk about that option too. The good parts in doing your own custom migration, the advantages are about how you can handle the content. These are some of the examples that I have done in a project for the Finnish National Land Survey when I migrated their old D7 site into Drupal 8, and also in the process I took another D7 site they had and merged it into the main site. So I had 2 sources and 1 destination. So the site structure was complicated. There was a very deep menu tree, I think 6 or 7 levels. We wanted to cut it down, so we didn't want it just as such. There were the content type configurations, especially on the other site, was very confusing. It needed a complete rework, but still the content needed to be moved. And there was confusion between entity types. They had used nodes instead of taxonomies, where taxonomies were the correct choice. So I just took the content types, the nodes, and converted them into taxonomy terms. Then there was some field remapping. For example, there was one case where they had defined 5 checkbox fields, 5 separate checkbox fields that actually carried data that was supposed to be in one field. So I just took those 5 fields and combined them into one multiple checkbox field. It's, I don't know, a small thing, but and it took some time, but it was major improvement for editor experience. And then, of course, combining, separating fields, processing them in different ways as possible. And the need for this comes from the business needs. So when the client needs the site to be better in some way, then this is the way you can do it. There's also downsides. It's a lot of writing YAML files. For that merging operation, I wrote about 60 or 70 YAML files for configuration. So I'm quite adept in writing YAML nowadays, and it doesn't go smoothly. It just doesn't. You have to go back and forth, and you have to try what actually happens. Especially as I started in the fall, Migrate API has developed since. There's improvements, and and there is a bit more documentation, but it took a lot of reading code and a lot of time in debugger and finding out ways to find out what's going on below the hood. And you will need to write your process plugins again, but do not fear that. It's fun, actually. And because the documentation is kind of spotty, I have kind of promised to try to help with it. I have to find the time still, and I got personally I got a lot of help on IRC on the Drupal Migrate channel. Mike Ryan and all the others involved there, they really do deserve praise for not only creating the awesome system of Migrate API, but also supporting it very, very actively, and they are actually really very helpful. So if you hit hard problems, difficult situations, go and ask them. They will know what to do. And there will be manual work left. The content editors will need to edit the content. There might be some formatting issues. And the menu structure won't be easy to get through just as it is. But I have this one example about taxonomies. We had on the old site, there was a list in taxonomy of Finnish municipalities because it was, I think, most used taxonomy on the site. But we got a new list of municipalities because they has changed. And the old version, there was two actually vocabularies. There was the Finnish names and there were the Swedish names. And how they used that was a bit confusing. So I wanted them to have one vocabulary, which is Finnish and Swedish names translated, which is kind of no-brainer. But we needed to map the references from the old taxonomy, from the legacy taxonomy, to the new one. So I built a simple migration to import the new municipalities as from CSV into the vocabulary. Then I mapped the old. I also imported the old list, and then I mapped them using the municipality names because I had nothing else to work on, because the names are supposed to be equal. So I wrote a process plugin for that. And this, you probably can't read it very well, but you don't have to. This is all the code that it takes to do that. So basically it takes the terms, loads their names, and matches them into the new vocabulary, and then outputs the new term ID, so that we will enter that into the target ID column in the reference field. It's very simple. Okay, so what kind of transformations you might need to do? These are examples of what I did. So I already mentioned that I converted nodes into taxonomy terms, and I combined the checkbox fields. There were values not very well defined structurally. I made them into key value lists. Also some custom plugins involved in that. And then there was some content manipulation, the actual markup. There were some HTML tables that needed to be handled in some way. So I wrote a simple plugin to sort of rewrite the tables. And of course there were custom text formats for some special groups of editors that needed to be mapped again into the new text formats. And also translations. Translations are a big thing. They require quite a lot of work, I think. And there was this special case in this one because the second site that was merged into the main site was done so that the default language was English, and on the new site and the old main site, the default language was Finnish. So I needed to flip those around on the other site, and that actually created some issues that I needed to go through. But it's just taking the data and transforming it, and it was done mostly by playing with default values and separating the migration process and filtering by field values. It's from afterwards. It's actually very simple to say, but it took some time figuring out. What did I learn about it? Like I said, most complicated part was definitely getting the translations correct. I don't know if it's partly because the translation system in Migrate API was still kind of a work in progress when I was doing this. I understand that there are some improvements that have been done just fairly recently. This process was completed in early this year. The site was launched early March, so I think January was around the time I was doing this, and at that time translation support was kind of it was behaving in some points a bit unexpectedly. You have to dig through the database. You will need to know your source database, the structure of the data. You will have to go through it, and you will have to learn the Drupal 8 database structure too. But I think that's just a good thing. It's useful to know the D8 database structure. And it is good to take some time for learning what the core plugins can do and how to utilize them the best. There are many plugins whose usefulness is, or what are all the things that you can actually do with those, and what's like the beef in those, and using also those for building your own on top of it. And then you need to warn the content editors, your clients, people probably, so that they will need to prepare. They will need to reserve some time for the moments in the process where you have the translation run through and the data is on the new site, and they will go look at it, and then it's like, oh, this is horrible, don't do this, this went all wrong, and then you roll back and then modify and run again, and then you do another iteration with that. So you will do it once, and then you will do it again. Menu structures, I couldn't really find a good solution to get the menu in a nice way in a completely different structure, because content was moved from one place to another. It was just way too complicated to map everything. It would have taken huge amounts of time. So I just pushed in the content, and there were some like people then who moved it around in the menu tree and renamed the menu links and all that. And you will need to use rollback a lot. And that's actually also a downside, because if you're running it on a virtual machine on your own computer, it's in some points it's very slow when you have a lot of content. You should also just run small batches of migration, so that if the content is uniform, then you can run like 5 items and see that it was right, and then roll back and do it again. And so do not run like 2,500 nodes each time, because it's going to cost you. Okay, I have a small example of how the translation works. It sounds very simple, really. This is the key parts from the configuration YAML that enables the translation importing. But So what I do here is I refer to the original migration that takes the content in, and I get the, because in D7 you have separate node IDs for each translation, and D7 you don't. They're all the same node ID, they just differ by the line code. So here I get the node ID for each of the translations, and then the migration plugin provides me with mapping to what the current IDs are, and then it just switches over the content to mapping them into the same node IDs and being translations of the same content. It looks very simple here, but getting your head around it and making it work it's not what 7 lines of YAML looks like. So if you have something else than Drupal to migrate, basically if you can get structured data from the system, you can do it. You can take whatever data and just push it into Drupal. You can have, like I said, CSV, XML, JSON data that you got from somewhere, and you just push it in through D8. You can do other CMSs. You can do it directly using the database, but then you will need a custom implementation so that you can read the database. It might be a lot easier to implement an export from the other CMS so that you will get the data as JSON, for example, and then just import the JSON. There are plugins in Migrate Plus for XML and JSON, and then there's Migrate Source CSV for CSV sources. And for example, I have one case where we should be getting a JSON export from Liferay 6, and I promised that I will get that into Drupal 8 if they get me the JSON. This is a simple example of CSV. It's the municipality import I was talking about before. So here we take the CSV columns, map them into source fields. I give them names. Row ID will be the key to identify unique rows, so that will be used to map the Finnish name and the Swedish name. And then there's field for Finnish name and Swedish name. And this is the shared configuration. And then I have a file for the Finnish import, which actually just creates one term on the Finnish name and then another separate import, which is in this group, which creates the Swedish names. And those are like 5 lines. It's very simple. And this kind of process can be done if you have data that updates continuously. This kind of process can be done on cron runs or something like that. It's very convenient. XMLs are complicated creatures. They can be very complicated creatures. In some cases, unfortunately, they're not that hard, but there's a lot of catches in dealing with XMLs like namespaces, and you might need to import attributes from XML elements. And there is some improvements in Migrate Plus Simple XML that makes it easier to handle it. I think it was committed last week or something like that. But XML takes a lot of processing to get the data, because element structure might be deep, so you will get arrays that have multiple dimensions, and you will need to flatten those creatively, and you might have empty values somewhere, and the process plugin for flattening arrays in core doesn't deal that well with empty values, so I needed to write a more robust version of that to handle values being empty. I created a XML import for National Land Survey for their digital products, which come from their own system as XML import, and the single language XML import was about 350 lines of YAML. So there are, I think, 40, 50 fields in those nodes. And this is an extract from that. So first, I use the URL plugin because it comes from online sources over HTTP. Use the simple XML parser, define the URL, define the namespaces that will be necessary for the XPath to process the XML, and then item selector defines one entity that is corresponds to one node in the end result, and then there will be all the fields, all the 40, 50 of them. And because the XML file is quite complicated, and then I will need to define the selectors very, very carefully, actually. But XPath stuff is just common outside Drupal things. So somebody probably has questions. I'm not sure that I can answer everything, but there will be a session after lunch by Lauris, and I think we can also go into deeper into those. If you want to say something about it, then just feel free. But yeah, but you had something.
So I think that at one point you kind of answered my question, but I just want to make sure. So you said that your big problem was dealing with translations.
Yeah.
And it seems that this old site was using the core translation and not the IE18N.
Yes.
Okay. Because I have a personal problem, and I want to get experience in translating a site that's based on IE18N.
Okay.
And that's tricky.
Probably. But I think it should be possible to map those in the source phase to match, maybe.
Again,
I haven't looked into that, so
because
don't really know.
my personal time, I kind of would like it to be
Easy, yeah. Okay. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Have you done migrations to D7 sites before Drupal 8, using the time when migrate?
The D6, D7.
Yeah, or whatever to.
Oh, the country migrate module. I have done some. I think one, some years ago. This is a lot better structured thing.
Well, because my next question was that what would the main difference be with the old content migrate module and then this D8 core migrate?
If I'm not
other than the YAML files.
If I'm not completely wrong, the work done for Migrate API is in some part based on what was built there, but it's very different. Partly because the Drupal core structure is now object-oriented PHP, and it gives you all the possibilities and makes things a lot easier. But I can't really compare those because there's so much time in between that I've used them.
It seemed quite similar, at least the concept.
Yeah, well, the concept is getting data from A to B.
Yeah.
How complicated can it get?
Have you already tested D8 to D8?
No, I haven't. But that shouldn't be complicated. I'm not actually sure if there is what the source support is.
Yes, you should.
You probably need to write your own. Yeah, well, actually, that's fairly simple. When Drupal 8 was in, I don't know, in early alpha or something, the Hungarian company Cheppers made one D8 site, and Amazy Labs also. Amazy Labs, I think, was the first Drupal company globally to make their own corporate site on Drupal 8, and they started in like Alpha 1 or something like that. And because there was absolutely no upgrade path back then, like 2.5 years ago. They just exported everything with views, I think, into CSV and imported the data. But back then there was no Migrate API either, so they made something similar. But for example, yeah, views exporting to CSV, and that's kind of the easy way out. But of course, I would recommend you to write source plugins that take D8 database as input. Still questions?
Related to that one, from D8 to D8, why not REST API?
Yeah, why not?
Well, actually, REST API is very closely related to Migrate API but the basic functionality is kind of the idea is similar, but the concept is different because REST API works with the idea is to work with like individual pieces of content and their relations, and with Migrate API you deal with the whole bunch of it, with everything at once. That is actually an interesting question whether which one of those you want to use, and you will have to consider those case by case, because you can do the same thing in both, and it depends on several things which one is better. And actually, one thing I didn't mention about the incremental migrations is that those kind of, because if you enable the change tracking, then you can just run the migration over and over again, and you can, for example, if the client doesn't want to transition from the old site right away, you can develop the new sites, and they can keep on entering the content on the old site, and the new site will be developed like in agile way, and you can deliver increments on that, and it will be in beta phase for undefined amount of time, and then you just run migrations over and over again. Now. Okay, we need to go to the group picture. So, thank you.